Well done for making it this far. Now in this lesson we will be covering comparatives and superlatives. Before we do get started, I would suggest you get yourself a nice cup of tea or coffee if you don't already have one. It's going to be a long lesson. So making comparisons is a requirement in any question. You'll find this sentence in any task 1 question. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where possible. So one way of making comparisons is to use comparatives and superlatives. So while this grammar is useful for any question, it is especially more useful for comparative graphs, tables, pie charts, and even maps. Here you have a table of the basic rules for comparative and superlative structures, and here are some adjectives and nouns, and what I want you to do is put these in the right column. So let's have a look at the answers. As you can see, most 1-syllable adjectives fall under this category, so you just simply add ER to the adjective. We do have exceptions. There are some 2-syllable adjectives where you do also add ER, but if they end in Y like these two, then you need to write IER. For 2 or more syllable adjectives, then you add more or less before it, and also nouns fall under this category. So for example, less tourists, more men, more people, more visitors, these are all nouns, and you simply add in more or less depending on which one you want. For superlatives, it's the same rule. For 1-syllable adjectives, you add EST plus that. Now that is very, very important. If you miss this out, then it's not really a superlative, so make sure you have your the before it. And if it's more than 2 syllables or it's a noun, then you add the most or the least, as you can see over here. So remember that comparatives compare 2 things or 2 groups of things only, whereas superlatives can compare more than 2. It can be 3, it can be 500, it can be 1000. There is no limit, but it's more than 2 things that's being compared. So it can also be used with adjectives and nouns, as we have here, as these examples show. You can use nouns in comparative and superlative structures as well. So let's have a look at modifying comparatives. Now, in order to be precise in your comparison, you have to modify it to show whether there is a big difference or a small difference. So in this exercise, go to page 36, and I want you to put these modifiers into either a big difference or a small difference. So here are the answers. In terms of a big difference, you have far, a lot, much, and considerably. In terms of a small difference, it's slightly, a little, and a bit. If you look at this chart, which is the pie chart about tourist nationalities, I want you to write a few sentences where you're comparing the nationalities to each other and modify. So let's have a look at what I wrote. There were considerably more European tourists than American. So as you can see, there were 60% European tourists and 20% American. And that's a huge difference. So I decided to use considerably. You can use any other one in this list as well. The number of Chinese visitors were slightly more than South Africans at 10% and 5% respectively. So there is a small difference between these two, and I've decided to use slightly because of that. So as you can see, by using these modifiers, you are being precise in the difference between the 2 things you're comparing. Now let's have a look at another comparative structure that you can use. So remember, to get a band 7, you need to use a variety of structures. So this is another one that you can use to make a comparison. X is not as adjective as Y. So for example, the UK is not as hot as the Maldives, or fencing is not as popular as football. You can also modify this structure to show a big difference or a small difference. So if you have a look at this chart, it's about Britain's favorite chocolates. You can compare these different chocolates using these modifiers. So let's first put them into either a big difference or a small difference. So these are the answers. For a big difference, nowhere near and not nearly. For a small difference, not quite and almost. I want you now to write some sentences for me where you are comparing these chocolates, so the popularity of these different chocolates, and make sure you modify them as well. So let's have a look at the answers. Mars is nowhere near as popular as Whisper. So Mars is at 80 and Whisper is at around 25. So there's a huge difference between these two. Twix is not quite as popular as Snickers. So Snickers and Twix is a small difference between the two. As you can see, that's the only difference between the two. And then Kit Kat is not nearly as popular as Dairy Milk. So Dairy Milk is at 60 and Kit Kat is at around 15. So there's a huge difference between these two, so not nearly as popular as Dairy Milk. And lastly, Kit Kat is almost as popular as Whisper. So here's Kit Kat, here's Whisper, and here's Kit Kat. So there's again a very small difference between these two. So as you can see, by modifying this structure, then you are being precise in the difference between the two. Let's now have a look at numerical comparatives, and this basically adds flexibility and style to your writing. So this is where you use numbers in word forms basically. So as you can see here, you have these three: twice, 3 times, and half, and you can pause here and fill in these gaps by looking at this chart. So here are the answers. Whisper is half as popular as Snickers. So Snickers is at 50 and Whisper is at 25, so it's half. Mars is twice as popular as Twix. Mars is at 80 and Twix is at 40, so it's double. So Mars is twice as popular as Twix. Galaxy is 3 times more popular than Whisper. So Whisper is 25 and Galaxy is at 75, so it is 3 times more popular. So by using these numericals, then you are creating a numerical comparative, and this adds, like I said, flexibility and style to your writing, which is always really good because it pushes your band up in grammar and lexical resource. Few things you need to avoid. One is using once. You cannot use once as a numerical comparative. And you also can't use less as well, so avoid using these two in a numerical comparative structure. So that's the end of this lesson. I will see you in the next one.